Hello, everyone. So, I am just starting this Instagram live right now, and I am about to invite my I guess, co-host for today from Shakti Therapy, Faith Yu. So, oh, there she is.
Hi,
Hello.
how are you
Good
doing today?
morning.
Good
I'm
morning.
doing well. How are you doing?
Pretty good, pretty good.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. How do you feel?
I feel pretty good about this. I'm excited. Um, I think it's just a really awesome place to just have a good conversation and, you know, get our thoughts out there from therapist to therapist. What
True.
about yourself?
I'm not gonna lie, I'm really nervous, but I feel good. I mean, we've prepped, we've talked about this, so yeah, I think we can get started. I'm gonna introduce myself, and
Mhm.
I'll let Faith introduce yourself, and then we can kind of get started with the questions that we're going to explore today. But
That sounds
yeah,
good.
hi everyone.
Cool.
My name is Jack Lamb. I use they, them pronouns. I'm a genderqueer, non-binary Malaysian Chinese immigrant, and I bring a compassionate, anti-oppressive lens to the therapeutic work that I do. I am an associate therapist as well as the outreach coordinator here at Yellow Chair Collective, which is a multicultural psychotherapy group with a special focus in Asian and Asian American mental health. So we provide our services online as well as in Los Angeles, and our offices are in Arcadia, Burbank, Manhattan Beach, and we strive to provide culturally responsive, trauma-informed, and LGBTQIA plus affirmative counseling. So we have counseling and support services available for children 5 and up, teens, couples, adults, families, and our services are provided in English, Korean, Mandarin Chinese, Cantonese, Japanese, Vietnamese, Hindi, Urdu, and etc. So yeah, that's a little bit about us, and I'll hand it off to you.
All right. Thank you for sharing. So,
Yes.
my name is Faith Yu. I'm an associate marriage and family therapist. I am with Shakti Therapy, and Shakti Therapy and Healing Services is a holistic psychotherapy group. And we, you know, created and joined together to help those with emotional pain that want to turn that pain into a personal strength. And so we just want to help people take control of their lives, bring back freedom into their lives, and, you know, be set free from the thoughts that are holding them back. And so we really use a personalized approach in our therapy. So it's, different for each person. We are a multicultural practice. We focus primarily on Asian, South Asian, and also Latinx clients. And we love to integrate a spiritual lens into our practice as well as holistic modalities such as crystal healing and ketamine assisted therapy. And so we serve children, teens, adults of all ages. Yeah, that's a little bit about us.
Okay. And are y'all based in LA as well, or are you virtual or both?
Yeah, so we're mainly virtual. We do have an office in out West LA for those that really want to do in person, but mostly virtual. Yeah,
Okay. That's
yeah,
interesting because I was thinking that when you were saying like crystal healing, I was like, how do you do that like virtually?
yeah. So for crystal healing and ketamine, mostly in person. Yes.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for sharing. And then just to give a little background for anyone watching, how this kind of started was we got a message from Shakti kind of inviting us to do this IG Live and to have this conversation.
Hmm.
And this is something that has affected both of us, me and Faith personally. So we really wanted to share about our experiences. So I think just to, preface this as a disclaimer for today, kind of, we're
Hmm.
talking about two individuals' experiences,
Yes.
as well as, our therapeutic lens with the clients that we've served and what we've seen as themes. So, of course,
Yeah.
this is not meant to be like a comprehensive and like all inclusive kind of thing.
Right. Right. We're just two people wanting to talk about things that, occur in our community, and um, wanting people to feel maybe heard or understood, or just hearing two people talk about something might help them to feel like, someone out there knows what I'm feeling. So, yeah, yeah.
Okay, and with that said, I think the first thing that we kind of talked about when we started thinking of the topic of sexual assault
Mm,
was really just kind of sex in general in our communities, right? How
yeah.
sex is perceived and how we learn and talk about sex.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, Faith, do you want to kind of start of us maybe like talking about your experience, like learning about sex and how sex was perceived in your life?
Yeah, absolutely. I can definitely share first. So as an Asian American growing up here in California, just sex was never talked about in my family. I come from a very Christian background and upbringing, and so if we did talk about sex, it was no sex until marriage. That was the only sex ed we got from my parents and my community. And they do have the sex ed in school, but it's very here's the body parts, here's what happens, you get pregnant, all these different things. And so I think just because it wasn't really talked about in our community and in my family, in my household, it's just something that kind of gets stigmatized, right? It's a
Mm.
hush hush situation. Um, you just kind of feel like, oh, it's a bad thing maybe to talk about since no one's talking about it. When someone doesn't talk about something, it becomes something that is maybe either a secret or maybe something that you don't want to express or you just don't ever want to talk about. And so um, I think it becomes something that can very easily just become something shameful, or
Yeah.
you don't want to be a part of that, right? And so that's kind of my background and how I think sex was stigmatized for me growing up. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think I definitely like, even though I grew up in Malaysia, but there's a lot of similar strains in that like there was a lot of silence around sex, right? Like we didn't talk
Yes.
about it, especially with my parents. I think I learned
Right.
I didn't learn about sex from what they said. I think I learned more about sex from what they didn't say, kind of thing.
Exactly. Exactly.
So, like I remember like growing up and watching TV and, like rom-coms were really big in the early 2000s and I loved them.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And, people would be like romantic and then things would like become sexual. And then of course, like a lot of the sex on screen was like ideal, perfect, like in these like ultra romantic situations. And then I remember looking at my parents and I was thinking, I've never even seen them kiss or hold hands. Like, I can't even think about them having sex and they don't talk about sex. So I'm like,
Right.
okay, I guess this is just maybe something we don't do. And that was
Mm.
like reinforced too by like the
Mm.
sex ed that we had in Malaysia. So Malaysia is an Islamic country. And I remember the sex ed that we got in our public school was basically like they showed us like quote unquote the male and the female body. And then they just said like, okay, like when it comes to sex, don't have it, basically. And like
Right.
they showed like censor bars. They were like, these are the breasts, don't touch them. This is the genital area, don't touch them. And then I remember the funniest thing was like, this is your mouth and this is your like these are your hands. Don't use them for sexual reasons. And I was like, this is so vague. First of all, like this is like ridiculously vague and like I don't know what you want
Right.
me to get out of this. And it was funny because we didn't even talk about pregnancy or anything like that. It was very interesting.
Mm,
No pregnancy, no contraception.
interesting.
That was all in like biology. We learned all of that in biology
Mm,
class.
yeah.
But yeah, I mean that was very, very striking to me because
Hmm.
at the time when we were like 13 or 14, when that presentation came into our school,
Hmm.
a lot of my peers were already talking about sex,
Mm,
right? And I
yeah.
think like teen at the time teen boys were very like open in terms of sexuality. Like there was
Mm.
that still that shame that was like almost like the shaming element was like, oh, like you're like turned on, ha 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 ha, that's really funny, or
Right,
like you're
right.
masturbating, or have you even masturbated? Kind of it's kind of like that same vibe of like, do you even lift, bro? But it's like, oh, did you even masturbate? Like that's so funny. Like you don't even know, I bet, blah blah blah.
Oh
All of these
man,
things. So
teenage boys.
so it's very interesting, to see that like we were having these conversations like unfiltered or like
Mm,
most of the times not even like just half knowing what they were talking about,
right.
but the adults like really just didn't want to address it at all.
Mm,
And most of the
yeah,
times we knew not to talk about it in front of the adults too. So
right, right. What do you think is your guess to why adults don't talk about it? Like when you were young.
I don't know. I think maybe because they just didn't know how to talk about it. And
Mm,
I think they think that by not talking about it, we won't learn about it kind of thing,
mm.
right? They didn't want us to be
Very good. Yeah.
exposed to sex.
Right.
And
Right.
the funny thing is, like, I remember just growing up and, like, I took computer classes at school, and, like, there would be, like, viruses on those computers and, like, porn pop ups all the time. And I'm like,
Mm,
how are you, like, still able to avoid this when literally, like, there are pop ups in our, like, school computers of, like,
right.
pornographic images? Like,
Right.
that just made it even, like, more like yeah, as you said, right? Like this hush hush thing where it's like, nope, just close the pop up and don't talk about it. Like let's not even address it.
Right. Right.
Um,
Right. Yeah. Absolutely.
right. But I know
Yeah.
for you, you had talked about like part of it being the religious background for you as well.
Right. Yeah. I think in the Christian culture and within the community, it's it's just there's so much shame and guilt, I believe, placed onto those that partake in any kind of sexual activity prior to marriage. And, I understand, it's in the Bible, it says that you're not supposed to have sex with someone that you're not married to. And so I understand the rules behind that and the reasonings behind that. But I think that the level and the layer of guilt and shame placed onto those that, you know, might experience it when they don't expect to, or even if they expect to. Um, there's so much of that guilt and shame placed onto them,
Mm,
um, and I mean, we're going to go talk about this a little bit more
yeah.
as we continue our conversation, but I think it prevents people that are experiencing anything like sexual assault to not be able to talk about what they're experiencing because it's you don't do it. So therefore, if you're doing it, then something's wrong with you, or you're sinful, or you're excommunicated, or like there's no grace, there's no outreach or anything like that I kind of grew up seeing, and so it was just kind of shunned, right? It was shunned. It was looked down upon, and um, when you have that guilt and shame that you're already feeling on top of we don't talk about this, then where do you go, right? Where do you go, and who do you go to, and
Yeah.
how do you talk about it, right? And yeah, so definitely some of those things that I kind of saw growing up, you know.
Yeah. And I think this kind of goes in beautifully into like the next point that we wanted to talk about, which is,
Yeah.
the silence really kind of leads to this like lack of support and
Mhm.
resources
Mhm.
for a lot of like Asian youth,
Mhm.
especially
Mhm.
especially youth, I guess, because you're in a more
Mhm.
vulnerable position, and
Mhm.
you expect to be able to be supported by adults, or you expect to be able to get help, but because it's so hush
Yeah.
hush and because it's so shunned, as you said, like
Mhm.
it's really hard to think about even talking about it.
Right.
So,
Right.
I think for me, I'll share a little bit about kind of like my experience when I was younger. I was sexually assaulted when I was around like maybe 9 or 10.
Mm.
And it was a family friend.
Mm.
And at the time, because we didn't talk about sex and we didn't really learn about consent or anything like that, I just remember thinking, oh my God, like that was sex. And I remember thinking, like, I actually, and this is the one thing that I think I feel really still a little nervous and kind of conflicted about because, oh, bless you, no worries.
Hmm.
And because I remember, so basically, um, trigger warning, I'm going to talk about sexual assault.
Right.
When I was 9 or 10, I was sexually assaulted. I was sleeping, and then I woke up to kind of someone sexually assaulting me. It was
Right.
another man. And I remember at the time, I didn't know what was going on because, we didn't talk about sex. And I just remember feeling really good, right? Like there was a lot of
Mm.
pleasure for me in that experience. And I instinctively knew though that was something that was wrong. That was something that I
Mm.
shouldn't talk about because well, it was happening in the middle of the night. And the next day, like my perpetrator didn't address it, didn't talk about it. Like every time I remember like being a child and not understanding, and I was like remembering saying like, oh, like I wanna share a bed with like this person again. And
Mm.
him being very like basically like, no, it's fine, it's whatever, like I can sleep whenever, wherever, right? Like just
Hmm.
making sure that it's like, oh, nobody should know, like nobody wants, you shouldn't bring this up, don't talk about this.
Right.
And that
Right.
was when I was like, oh, this is like our secret kind of thing. And
Mm.
it was really, I don't know. I mean, at that point, I was still really young. So I don't think I understood the full weight of it until a few years later when I kind of, this is tangled up with my sexual orientation, where when I started realizing that I might have been gay or queer, that experience made it really complicated for me because
Mhm.
um, it made me question, like, am I gay because of that experience, right?
Mm.
Because there was this like huge like myth stereotype thing of like, I remember the two things that I used to like look see on like online when I was looking up like, am I gay quiz, stuff like
Mhm. Mhm.
that. And the two things that they used to say was
Mhm.
like, oh, your child might be gay if like there was an absent dad and there was an overbearing mother, which I thought
Mm.
maybe, I don't know. And then the second
Mhm.
one was like if they were sexually assaulted at a young age.
Mm.
And I was thinking like, oh my God, like now my whole life is kind of changed because I've
Mm.
had this like terrible sexual assault thing happen to me, and that compounded on the
Right.
shame because I knew being gay was very wrong. And when I thought about the sexual assault, I was like, oh my God, like, well, I guess I can't even talk about that now even more, right? Because if I do, what if they make that connection that like, oh, maybe because I've been sexually assaulted as a child that they'll know I'm gay because apparently that's the myth that like you turn gay when you're sexually
Right.
assaulted.
Right.
So, and a big part of it was, not wanting to get my family friend in trouble or like not wanting people to know and then affecting the relationship that my family might have with this person and their family because we were very close in terms of family.
Mhm.
Um,
Mhm.
so yeah, those were all the considerations that I was thinking of even when I was like 9 to 12.
Mm. Mhm. Yeah.
Um,
Which is so much for you to hold on to as a young child,
right.
right? A nine,
Yeah.
10-year-old is so little, right? And you're holding on to all of these burdens and different things that you can't talk about, and um, how painful, how lonely, you know,
Yeah.
that must have felt.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you so much for sharing your story,
Of course.
especially in front of people on a live. Yeah.
Of course. But yeah, I mean, I'll pass it on to you because I know you wanted to talk about kind of your experience as well.
Hmm. Hmm. So for me, I guess my experience with sexual assault, and I also want to preface, as I talk about different themes like Christianity and sexual assault too, that my experience is very personal and it's not the same for every single person that might, be a Christian and have experienced sexual assault. It could be totally different, right?
Right.
People could have been in a similar situation to me, but had a extremely supportive and loving community that I maybe not didn't get to experience myself. And so just want to preface that. But for me, my assault was less about the actual action, I guess, if you can say that.
Mm.
But it was more about the guilt and shame that I felt from my religion. And so,
Mm.
so what I mean by that is, um, I think there was so much, stigma and shame around being, I guess, having had sex before outside of marriage. And when you partake in any of that, even if it's something that you want or you don't want, it's just so looked down upon. And it's kind of, you're placed into this other category of like, you know, you're othered, or you're sinful, or you're a bad Christian, or just all these labels that people put onto you. And I know about these labels because I've put those labels on other people, right?
Yeah.
And um, you learn about and like start these labels and these judgments, because you're taught them, whether it's in not I don't think like it's taught like in church, like church leaders are like, you should
You
do
should
this,
shame them.
right?
Yeah.
It's not like that. It's not
Right.
straightforward like that. I think some churches, if I could be completely honest, might do that. I haven't experienced it myself, but it's talked about within peers and within smaller groups, or you see people do it, so you just pick up on it, and or you see others do it, like elders or people that might be in positions of leadership. And so you learn that, and when you learn that people that do that are bad, and then you happen to fall into a situation where you are sexually assaulted, it's like, oh, then I just immediately also a bad person. And even if this wasn't something that I necessarily wanted or was trying to do, assault is never something that you want. um, you still like place yourself into that category of like sinful, bad, shame, guilt, all these things. And so I think for me, it was just really about not having anyone to talk to, right? Because my experience, I I went through it as a teenager, and when I was a teen, no one was talking about this, right? No, I didn't hear the term sexual assault in everyday vocabulary. I'd never heard of anyone personal, like in my life, that had experienced this. And so when I experienced that, I was like, oh, I'm like the only person in this world, right? That's how I felt, right? I knew that wasn't the truth, but it felt like I was the only person in the world that had experienced that. And so
Yeah.
on top of the hush hush, we don't talk about sex, it was extremely, I felt so isolated, and just so like no one could come through my walls, because not only am I hurting because of what happened, but I'm also hurting because I have no one to talk to, because no one else would understand, because everyone else would judge me. And so just that having that experience was extremely painful and lonely, and just probably one of the worst experiences of my life. And so just knowing that that's happened to me is something that I think about, of how many other people in similar situations to myself might be feeling. And so it's a very saddening realization.
Yeah. And I think
Yeah.
about like the two things that came up for me as you're talking about it. I feel like it's so interesting because I feel like, with the recent, as we're, I mean, I don't know, growing up, I think one of the things we talked about was noticing
Yeah.
like there's so many, it seems like there's so many more conversations around like consent and sexual
Yeah.
assault.
Yeah.
But it's so weird that as like younger folks, like for some reason we didn't see it or had no access to that.
Mhm. Mhm.
And the other thing that I think of too is like when it happened, right? Like the sexual assault happened. It's kind of like as you said, it's kind of like you're then thrust into this category of like being labeled all of these terrible things. And for me, that was also really like conflicting because for the longest time, I never really viewed myself as a victim, right? When I was a child, like
Mm,
it was hard for me to see myself as a victim because again, like there was that pleasure aspect of it, which added on to the guilt of and shame of like, oh my God, like even when I realized sexual assault was a thing, I remember reflecting on that experience and being like, wait, I was sexually assaulted. And wait, like I enjoyed it. That
mm,
must have been terrible. Like, am I a terrible person for like,
mm.
quote unquote, deriving, enjoying or deriving
Right,
pleasure from sexual assault?
right.
And it was because I think the victim, I viewed it more as like, sex is sex and I was a participant and sex happened. It doesn't matter like who
Mm,
initiated it, what the
right,
circumstances were, but you've had sex and therefore you are now a deviant kind of thing.
right, right.
And yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think when we don't talk about sex and we don't provide like adequate sexual education, then
Mm-hmm,
these are the kind of
mm-hmm,
nuances that unfortunately a lot of people are not able to grasp. And they just kind of view it more so in the binary of like people who've had sex and people who have not had sex.
mm-hmm,
And whether or not it
mm-hmm.
was consensual or not, like now I've had sex. And unfortunately, like
Right.
now all the labels, as you said, like apply to me. And that was really, really, really hard.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I think, yeah, I think something that comes up for me when you share that is, um, kind of how you mentioned like, oh, I enjoyed it. So am I a bad person now? And that makes me think about like, what is the importance of learning about consent and learning about what sexual assault is? Because, if we're young and we're kids and we haven't been taught those things, we can continue to, like you said, I think you mentioned this, how you kind of the next day we're like, oh, are we gonna, sleep in the same bed again or et cetera? And we don't know what sexual assault can be or what that can look like, and that can lead to more and more pain and horrible things happening. And I think, as sensitive of the topic sex is, the earlier that you teach your children these things and learn about these things, the better that you're protected and the better that you know and stop things from happening rather than letting these things continue, right? We kind of talked about how um, we might think that our parents didn't talk about it because they were trying to protect us or they didn't want us to partake in it. But the truth is, it's I think more damaging, to not talk about these things, unfortunately, than to actually talk about them and understand what is happening and what's not, right?
Right.
And so it's it's unfortunate, right? But that's kind of how it's been.
Yeah.
And so, yeah.
Yeah. I think, you know, we avoid, or our parents may have avoided the topic of sex to kind of protect us from the reality of it, right? But then,
Hmm.
like, it backfires in the sense of, like,
Yeah.
if and when it does happen, and unfortunately, sexual assault does happen very frequently,
Very
then
frequently.
we don't have the language and we don't know if it's
Mm.
even, like, okay to kind of talk about it because
Yeah.
they've never talked about this.
Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
And, I think the next part that we wanted to talk about was maybe more so finding healing, right? And
Hmm. Hmm.
this is, part of that is definitely something that we've been talking about, which is destigmatizing, right? Being able to kind of try to openly talk about sex and
Hmm.
sexual assault and trauma.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
I just wanted to hear maybe your experience, right? Like how, being mired in like this guilt and this shame of all of these
Yeah.
hush hush situations, like how did you end up getting support and getting to where you are now where you're openly talking about it on an IG live?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm gonna be straight up honest. I still feel a little bit of like, oh, like what if someone that I know sees this and hears about this, and I still have a little bit of that maybe shame. tied to this, unfortunately, that I, still work through and I probably will work through for the rest of my life. Um, but of course, feel a lot more open about this and have talked about this openly with a lot of people in my life. So, have come a very long way. Um, so I think what was one of the main factors for me in terms of healing and destigmatizing sexual assault at at a young age was um, being very lucky to be in a place where I had someone in my life share their story, and it was a very open story in front of 10, 12 people that I was on a missions trip with, and I had never in my life heard anyone tell their story of sexual assault, and much less in front of a group of people. Yes, it was a small group, but still in a group of people. And um, I remember that moment when this person shared their story, um, how it like unlocked this part of me that made me feel so seen and so understood. Um, just extremely powerful, just like, wow, like I'm not alone. And I had felt so alone for the past 6, 7, 8, 9 months, right? And so just having that, like, oh my gosh, someone actually has experienced what I've experienced and is talking about it openly, that was just this incredibly powerful moment for me that I got to experience. And so, connecting with this person afterwards and having that moment to share my story for the very first time out loud was the most powerful moment, honestly, in my life. And just could feel, the walls crumbling down. And um, yeah, as dramatic as it sounds, it was really that powerful. And so, yeah, just kind of, I just realized in that moment that, like, if you talk about it and you openly share about something that people don't usually talk about, you are literally doing what is destigmatizing, right? You are literally taking away that shame and guilt when you talk about something openly rather than not talking about it. So, um, I will be forever grateful to that person that had the brave spirit, the brave just being so strong enough to share that story because it changed my life. So
Oh,
yeah.
that's amazing. And, I
Yeah.
think of how powerful it is to kind of speak those words and that experience into spaces where, as you said, like
Hmm.
felt like have been unsafe or felt like it's been like shut down, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And that, I'm it's not lost on me that you're sharing your experience here, and I hope that, that also is able to like resonate with people who are watching and kind of
Yeah.
prompt them to kind of explore their story.
Hmm. Hmm.
I think
Absolutely.
I think for me, when I thought about like my experience of sexual assault and how
Hmm.
I learned about it was in my first relationship when I
Mm.
was 18 or 19. And I started being sexual, right, consensually with my partners. And there was suddenly this like barrier of like this feeling of general like unsafety,
Mm.
and a lot of shame, definitely a lot of shame, right? Like it was really hard for me for many, many, many years. Um, and maybe even to this day, right? Still to talk about it, I still get like really uncomfortable
Yeah.
sharing aspects of experiences when it comes to sex.
Hmm.
Um, but I remember being with my first partner and thinking about like how to even like I couldn't even name sexual acts. I couldn't like
Mm.
feel good about talking about like having sex. It was a very like a skirt around, like
Hmm.
um insinuated, hinted at, but never really
Hmm.
saying it
Hmm.
even. It's like,
Hmm.
like, oh, are we gonna do the thing? And like all of these things that became really like
Right.
so embarrassing and almost shameful for me to like verbalize even.
Yep. Yep.
And that was when like I remember one of the big things I really struggled with was, when thankfully, right, like now we're exposed to a lot more like coverage and people sharing about like
Mm,
sexual assault, which,
hmm.
again, helps destigmatize, which is why I'm thankful, not because there's a lot of sexual assault.
Right,
Um,
absolutely.
but like that really helped me to kind of reflect like, oh my God, wow, like that wasn't consensual, right? Like when I
Hmm.
think about like my childhood experiences, and even though I did derive pleasure from it, it was still not something that I had wanted. It was not something that I had
Hmm.
known about,
Hmm.
that I willingly engaged in.
Hmm.
Um, and so, you know, and to a sense, it's great, but there's still so much more like education and psychoeducation that needs to be done, I think, around like sex
Yeah.
and sexual assault. Because I remember in that context when I first learned about it and reflected, and I was like, oh wow, I think I was sexually assaulted, right?
Hmm.
That had happened when I was 9 or 10, and I have finally had the language or exposure to like these experiences when I
Mm,
was like 18 or 19.
right.
And that was when I was like, oh my God, like they're saying that this is like traumatic and that I'm traumatized now, and
Mm,
I didn't understand what that meant. I was just like, wow. And then it
mm,
became this second wave of like, oh my God, like, so because this happened, like now I'm broken or like I'm
mm,
less of a person. Like I felt really even worse because I was like, wow, this is something that happened to me without my control. And now it seems like I'm like mentally scarred or mentally hurt for the rest of my life. Even
right.
though, even though looking back, I can tell that like I wasn't experiencing many of the trauma symptoms that a
Hmm.
lot of people were talking about when they were talking about sexual assault, which is why,
Yeah.
we were talking about how sexual assault is such an individualized, unique experience for people, and how the impact of it and how they experience it after is so different. And I bring
Hmm.
this up because unfortunately, like a few years later, which is like 3 or 4 years before this, today, like
Hmm.
I had another like experience where I was um, almost sexually assaulted, pressured,
Mm,
and that experience was a lot more traumatizing for me, right? Like the year after, I did experience a lot of the trauma symptoms of like nightmares, cold sweat,
mm,
flashbacks, avoidance, fear, anxiety, um, not being able to talk about it.
yeah.
And that was when I realized, like, okay, like, I've had multiple experiences, and each time, like, the impact is different depending on what the context is and depending on, like, how, how I felt in that moment, right?
Yeah.
And what
Exactly.
really helped was, hearing other people share their stories, learning more about, like, trauma impact, and
Hmm.
being more comfortable with the idea that trauma is different for everybody, and that, like, even just knowing that like the trauma responses, right? Like fight, flight, freeze, or fawn, that, when I was freezing and when I was like fawning in the
Mm,
situations after my assaults, that it was like a completely normal reaction. Because again, like with that feeling of brokenness, I really did blame myself a lot for like, why didn't you do anything? Like
mm,
even in the second, like even though you knew about it and you've learned about this, like the second time it happened, like why didn't you act, right?
right.
And being
Right.
able to like learn that, okay, these are like protective mechanisms that like my body employed on its own, really helped me be like, okay, I was trying my best, and I
Yeah.
can't, like I can't be blamed for
Hmm.
being put in a situation where I was coerced and
Yeah.
forced. So
Absolutely.
yeah, a lot of therapy, a lot of sharing with other people, a lot of like
Hmm.
being able to have understanding friends and support systems that really helped me feel a lot more
Yeah.
comfortable.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I love that you share those things about what kind of helped you through those moments because, you
Mhm.
know, we do need help. We do need people that understand us that can share stories that can be there to tell us it wasn't our fault, right? All of these things are so important after you've experienced something as horrible as sexual assault. And so, um, yeah, I love that you were able to have the knowledge and also have the resources, have the support around you to help you, through that painful experience. And so, yeah. And another point that that crossed my mind while you were sharing your story was, you had these two separate experiences, and after learning about the first experience and how it's supposed to be traumatic, and now you're a broken person, and that's just another great illustration of how each incident is so different, right? Not every
Mm.
single person is going to respond to a certain incident the exact same way, right?
Right.
And some people are a lot more traumatized and hurt, and it shows, outwardly than other people, right? Some other people are a lot more inwardly hurt and or don't show it as much or don't have the symptoms like nightmares and flashbacks and stuff like that, but instead it's more of an internal fight or internal battle that they're experiencing. And so um, yeah, it does look different for every person, and I think that's why it's important to talk about it, right?
Mm.
Because then you can compare and see how other people have experienced different things and know that your situation is not wrong, or it's not um, something that is you're like, oh, now you're traumatized but actually you're not, or oh my gosh, I am traumatized but people are saying it's not a big deal, right? It's like normalizing, like, all of these responses are okay and normal, and it's okay to have a different reaction or response than someone else. And um, kind of segueing into therapy, you
Mm.
know, being able to talk about these things in therapy can help you to understand, like, oh, this is something that I experience and it does look different than someone else's, but that's okay. And,
Mhm.
being able to talk about your personal experience, I think, is so important in that aspect.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And, I'm really glad that we get to have this conversation and like share
hmm
our different experiences around like sexual assault. I know
hmm
that you mentioned talking about kind of how even though right now it feels like nice to be able to destigmatize, you've mentioned that it's also really sometimes like for a long time, you didn't really like sharing it.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, I think, I mean, of course, the shame and the guilt that I talked about um, prevented me from talking about it. And I think it was because I was so surrounded by, the communities that I was surrounded by and how it was so looked down upon. But I think
Mm.
the more that I did openly talk about it, and when I say openly, I mean like with a close friend here and there, not shouting it from a live Instagram,
You're not doing these
right?
lives every week?
This is normal for me. um, I mean, it's been what, 12 years now since that incident, and so the sexual assault, and so I think the next five-ish years, give or take, were just a growing experience for me to slowly, with people that I love and trust, talk about these experiences. And I think one huge reason that pushed me to talk about it more was whenever, of course, obviously not every single time, but majority of the time, unfortunately, the majority of the time when I would share my experience with someone, they would have a very similar experience to share back. And I say unfortunately because that just means, the number of people that have been sexually assaulted is so high, right? That
Yeah.
most of the people that I talk to would have a story to share back. And so, but I feel like that was such an encouraging part of sharing my story, because people would actually talk about theirs. And a lot of these people, and not most of them, but a lot of them would be telling me for the first or second time, right? Like telling it out loud for them, right? Like they were able to talk about their stories, something that they hadn't been able to talk about before because no one else had shared their story before them, right? Before me. And so um, I think when I open that door to talking about sexual assault with someone, they're a lot more likely to walk through that door than if I hadn't opened that door. And so, just like how someone had opened the door with me, now I took on this. I would love to be that person for someone else,
Yeah.
because I understand how much it helped me and how much I benefited from someone being vulnerable and doing their best to destigmatize and sharing what their experiences so that hopefully, you know, not just so that people will be touched by the story, but also to open that door to talk about their own stories if they, hadn't had that opportunity yet. So,
Oh,
yeah.
I love that. Yeah, I think
Yeah.
that's still so important as we're, hopefully having more conversations around this and adding more
Mm-hmm.
nuance every time.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things
Mm-hmm.
that, as you were talking about, this journey that it's been like 12 years
Mm-hmm.
and it still feels like a little like nerve nerve wracking to like share
Yeah.
this. It's true. I
Yeah.
mean, it's like every time like opening up does still feel raw because you never know how people are going to react.
Exactly.
And
Exactly.
there's this like I think there's this fear of people challenging for me, especially like there's this fear of people challenging my narrative or people like maybe invalidating what is sexual
Mm-hmm.
assault and what is trauma because
Mm.
there's this, there is still like a mainstream or like a um, stereotypical or generalized like depiction of sexual assault and trauma,
Yep.
whereas in real life it can be a lot more nuanced than that, right?
Yeah.
Like I think about
Yeah.
like how when I thought about sexual assault, I always just thought about like someone who's a stranger, forcing you into an alley and it's like aggressive and like definitely you
Yeah.
try to fight, but in my experience, it's like, oh, it's a family friend, and oh, it was a partner, and it was a friend,
Mm-hmm.
like people that you
Mm-hmm.
knew
That you
and
trusted.
that you trusted. Yeah.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it's like, it in the real life experience is a lot harder to untangle because, and for me, it still took like, even though I knew about sexual assault and like the basics of like trauma and stuff like that, like it still
Mm-hmm.
took me 3 years to kind of be able to understand and heal because I was very conflicted and I also understood, right, like coming from this environment of like not having this sexual education and not
Mm-hmm.
having this proper conversations around consent and stuff, like people
Yeah.
are so prone to, I don't want to say accidentally assault someone, but like they just don't have the tools to really like garner consent or have conversations about sex,
Mm-hmm.
and so they default to
Mm-hmm.
like very, they want sex but they don't know how to talk about it, so they just do it and then it becomes problematic, right? It's not
Right.
always the fact that like I'm setting out to like hurt someone, sexually assault someone. Of course, I'm
Right.
not saying that that doesn't happen,
Right.
but
Absolutely.
that it again, it's like it's such a varied, wide variety of experiences that fall
Mm-hmm.
under this like category of like sexual
Mm-hmm.
assault.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And to kind of piggyback off of that, I think that a lot of people that unfortunately are assaulters, like you said, like if they had known about how to have consent or what is the right way and what is not the right way, not like the what's hurtful and what's not hurtful, right? I think um, a lot of these instances, of course, not all of them, but a lot of these instances could be prevented. And um, I think it's, again, that hush hush culture that fosters this,
Yeah.
right? Because the more you don't talk about it, the less that you know. And um, unfortunately, if you don't know, then you kind of do whatever you want or whatever you think, right? And so I think talking about this conversation and destigmatizing sexual assault is not only helpful for people to not be assaulted, but also to hopefully prevent some assaulters from doing something that might hurt someone that they might not realize, right, is hurtful, or they just kind of don't really know. And so I think it's a win-win in both situations to talk about it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. And
Yeah.
any closing thoughts, I guess, that you have that you want to share before we kind of, yeah, end the live for today?
Yeah. Um, I think that one last point about sexual assault is that it really is something that, and this goes for trauma as well, but it is something that really does affect not just your body or not just your mind or not just your spirit, but just, all encompassing. It can affect all of that. And I think that really healing from just different parts of who you are, right? Not just one like physical aspect or mental aspect, but it really is about the totally encompassing um, act of healing that I think, therapy can provide for those people, is so important to realize, because some people just think like, oh, I just need to, you know, heal mentally and that's it. But like
Yeah.
physically, there's so many things that are going on, right? Whether it's like GI issues or, stress that is affecting your brain and causing you to, have all these different ailments. And so it really is about encompassing all of that. I think that um, being knowledgeable and just understanding that aspect is super important as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The like that very sounds very much like it sounds like you provide this like holistic view and understanding like all of the things that intertwine, because it's true, it's not just a mental thing, it's like it's literally like
Yeah.
your body that was like violated in a sense.
Right. Right. So yeah, understanding the whole holistic view is super important. Yeah.
Eh,
Any last thoughts for you?
mm, yeah, I guess for me, I think the last thing I will say is there is, I think this is like the social worker part of my brain because I'm
Hmm.
an associate clinical social worker, but it's like
Hmm.
the system itself right now as it is
Mm.
really like unfortunately very unsupportive for people who are
Mm.
survivors of sexual assault. I think of, of course there's the cultural pieces that we've talked about, like sociocultural pieces that are like hush hush
Yeah.
culture, like shame, but also like legally and systemically, it's really hard to think about talking about it, right? Because the only legal recourse really is to report it. And then
Right.
you're really opening up about such vulnerable things to strangers, often law enforcement, which, for a lot of like queer and POC folks, yeah, law enforcement is like, it's really, no, I'd rather not. And then,
Right.
and then it doesn't really, and it's like, and this is why I thought about it for a long time too, is because like the legal recourse is, maybe you report it, and then what happens next is like, okay, what if you go to court? And then you would have to literally like open up about your sexual assault to like a jury and judge, like more
Yeah.
people that you don't know, right? And then the only like really like quote unquote justice that you get is like that your perpetrators might be fined or jailed or whatever. But oftentimes, as we've seen in the media, like that doesn't even happen,
Yep. Yep.
right? And so it's kind of like that is the only option, and you have to weigh like, okay, do you actually like really want to put your perpetrator in jail?
Mm.
Potentially, right? At the
Mm-hmm.
cost of like opening up such a vulnerable part of yourself to
Right.
so many strangers.
Right. Right.
And so I found myself stuck in a place of like, okay, well, then I really don't know what else to do. All I want is like maybe an apology or an acknowledgement or something that will
Right.
actually help prevent this from happening again in the future, as
Mm-hmm.
opposed to a legal thing. But
Mm-hmm.
I think that's where systemically we still have a lot of work to do to move towards like actual
Mm-hmm.
restorative justice kind of frameworks where we're able to understand that this is not like a, a black and white issue kind of thing, and like
Mm-hmm.
that we need people to, I don't know, like just provide more education, understanding, counseling, therapy, healing work to
Yeah.
everyone so that we can talk about this, we can support people who've experienced this harm, as opposed to like opening them up to more harm so that they can have ultimately a carceral solution that really isn't a solution, because yeah,
Yeah.
what do you get out of putting your perpetrator behind bars, really? Like,
Exactly.
yeah, I think
Exactly.
that's my final thoughts.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing that.
Of course.
It is such a horrible, like, what do you do after,
Yeah.
right? except of course the healing aspect for like for yourself. But there is so little that you can do, and even if you do put yourself through all of that, it might amount to nothing, right?
Right.
And so it's really I feel like just so unfortunate in all aspects of if you're ever caught in that situation. So, which I feel like is a whole another topic that we could talk about for another hour,
Yes.
but
Yes. But
but
we'll
we'll
stop
save
there.
that for next. Yeah, we'll save that
Yes.
for next time.
Um,
Alrighty.
so
Yeah.
if they want to find you, Faith, and your work, where can they go?
Yeah, absolutely. So, our website is shaktitherapyhealing.com. You can learn more about our clinicians, and there are a few of us that have different specialties and what you might be looking for. We also you can also find us through our Instagram here. I think our Instagram might be linked together with yours
I think so.
for this live. Yeah, so you can find us there. Yeah, I think it'd be awesome to if you guys are interested to come say hi if you want to. If you want to talk, I'm here and open and available. So please do.
Are you currently taking clients?
I am currently taking clients. Yeah.
Okay, well, good to know. And for me, I am at Yellow Chair Collective. So similarly, you can find us through Instagram, right? And we also have our website, yellowchaircollective.com.
Mhm.
We provide like therapy services as well as support groups. A lot of
Mhm.
our support groups include like I guess the recurring ones are like Asian American Experience Support Group, which I think there's one
Mm.
coming up soon, and then the Highly Sensitive Person Support Group, which is also starting up soon, and then the other
Mhm.
ones that we usually sometimes will be coming up again in the future are like our ADHD coaching group, as well as our Asian Female and Femme Body Journey group, which deals
Mm.
with body image. So yeah, that's where you can find us. And if you're interested in more interviews with therapists, you can also check out our podcast, which I host, Yellow Chair
Awesome.
Collective, the podcast. It is
Love your little
available.
plug.
Thank you. It is available on Spotify, Apple
Oh,
Podcasts,
wow.
Google Podcasts, and YouTube. So feel
Awesome.
free to check it out.
That's awesome.
Thank
Where
you.
can people find this live? Are we going to post it on here and YouTube? Is that kind of our plan?
Yeah, I think we'll try to save it here. Are you comfortable with this being posted on YouTube?
Absolutely. I am. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So that's where we can find
Okay.
it. Right. Well,
Awesome.
thank you
Cool.
for taking the time today, Faith.
Of course. Thank you so much for, this time and your sharing of experiences and really appreciate our conversation.
Me too.
Yeah.
All right. Bye.
Bye.